Why would you sew? You could be creative and unique. Make things that you can't find at the department store. Make whatever's in your imagination. Sewing is so unique and individualized, and it's so cool. You can be creative. Create something. See it, like it, make it. Here are some sewing tools we're going to need to finish some of our projects. We've got pins. There's lots of different shapes and sizes. Cool thing about this is it's a magnet. You can just put it on the table. If you drop a whole bunch, pick them up. It's pretty easy. There's long ones, there's short ones, there's colored heads, there's flat pins. There's so many different types of pins. But when you use a pin, all you have to do is stick it through the fabric once, move the pin 90 degrees, and push back through. It holds 2 pieces of fabric together, 5, doesn't matter. Does a great job holding stuff together. Marking pens. This is a chalk liner. When you want to draw something onto your fabric, you just draw it like that. Then if you want to brush it off, go right ahead. Pretty slick. There's also marking pens. This is a light colored marking pen for darker fabrics. They also have darker color marking pens when you use light colored fabrics. They're water soluble, so all you have to do is spritz them with water and they disappear. Rulers. There's 2 different types that I have demonstrated here. They're both 6 inches. This one is see-through, so if you wanted to put it on top of your fabric and cut a straight line or mark, it's easy to do so because you can see through it. This one is for hems. It has a slide thing in the middle, so you can mark your hem, make it the proper length for both sides of the left and right pant leg. Here's some safety pins. I've got 4 different sizes here, but they come in plenty more. The small one is good for smaller projects. When we're using it for our pajama pants, the top hem, we're going to use a safety pin to thread our elastic through, and I'll demonstrate that later. Here's a seam ripper. It's also very essential for sewing because when you make mistakes, you can just slip it under the thread and it cuts pretty easy. I've had to unsew lots of things. Cutting tools. We've got scissors and rotary cutters. Both have a purpose. This is pinking shears. Along with making a decorative edge, when you cut fabrics that are delicate and that would fray easily, you want to use pinking shears because it makes it easier to sew with them. These are my fabric-only scissors. I don't use them on anything else. They dull quickly if you use them on anything other than fabric. They're super expensive to start with, and you don't want to have to repurchase them. Here are my thread scissors. This one has a really sharp point that you can get in really close to the fabric and cut off the threads that you need. These are called blunt nose scissors. They're good for just general cutting. When I'm at the sewing machine, that's what I use them for. Now we have our rotary cutters. These are 2 different sizes that I have here, a large and a small. This one is a straight blade, and this one's a pinking shears. This pinking one is just like you would for the pinking shears. You use them on delicate fabric or if you want a decorative edge. Don't use your rotary cutter without a self-healing mat underneath because whatever surface you're cutting on will get damaged. Not a good idea. Here's some thread, which is essential for sewing. You're going to need thread in almost any project you do. There are different types of needles. The eye is dependent on the thread size. When you're using a large darning needle like this one, you'll have to use larger stitches with larger thread. When you're using smaller embroidery needles, you have to use a smaller size thread, and it's for more delicate projects. Hand sewing. Why would you do hand sewing? What if you had a button that fell off? What if you had a seam that came undone? You're going to have to hand sew it together, even if you don't have a sewing machine. I'll show you how to do it. Never take more than an arm's length worth of thread. If you do, it's going to get all tangly. Once I've cut my thread off, I've got my needle. You always want to put the end of the thread through the eye of the needle. Done. But if I don't put a knot at the end, it won't stay in the fabric. So how I do a knot is I take my index and thumb finger and move them about 3 inches apart. Move them together in a straight line and you get a circle. Put the end of the thread through the circle and you now have a knot at the end of your thread. I've already got one started here, how you would use a running stitch. This is what you would use if your seam in your pants came undone and you'd have to sew them back together. What you want to do is put your needle through the fabric all the way through, then come up again and keep repeating that until you get to the end. Pull your thread and you've done a running stitch. Sometimes you want to make really small stitches. You could go down through the fabric and up again, really close to the fabric. There's also different kinds of stitches, the blanket stitch, a decorative stitch, blind hem stitch, plenty of different stitches to keep you busy. The reason you do a running stitch is to baste something together, to make it a mark where you're supposed to be sewing on the sewing machine, or if you've got some fine, delicate thread that you want to use for a little hem on the bottom of some pants, then you'd use a smaller needle and a smaller stitch. Hand sewing, pretty fun. When you're thinking about your project, make sure you think about your fabrics as well. There's 2 main categories. You have woven and non-woven. When you're dealing with a woven fabric, there's things called a warp and a weft. The warp is the vertical lines in your fabric. That's what was put on the loom. And then the weft is what is woven in between the threads of the warp. When you walk into a fabric store, it could be a little intimidating about the type of fabric you want for which project you're going to do. So hopefully we'll educate you on that. This is a sheer weight polyester that's a synthetic fabric. It's great for curtains, it's easy to sew with, and it flows well. This is a lightweight knit. This is what t-shirts are made out of. It's pretty easy to sew with, but you have to make sure you have lots of pins, and it stretches pretty much on the bias. But the fabulous thing about knits is it doesn't fray. You can cut it, and it just self-heals. This is of a more chunky knit. This one requires a little bit more extra care when sewing. Then you've got your flannel, which is also very helpful when doing clothing, especially when you're doing pajama pants like we are today. There's also polar fleece, which is kind of the same thing as flannel, but thicker, and it doesn't fray. This is a jean fabric, great for, obviously, jeans, or other home decorating projects that you need a jean accent for. Now here's all-purpose cotton. Cotton is great for many different uses. Clothes, curtains, bags, pillows, anything you can think of. Quilter's cotton is a great choice for an all-purpose project. Then you have a more decorative one like this, the silk. Obviously great for curtains and more home decorating projects, but I've also used them in purses as well. And the last 3 I've chosen here are more decorative fabrics that are heavier weights and a little bit more challenging when you're working with several layers of them in the sewing machine. Now for a non-woven category, that basically includes felt. Felt is great for craft projects and embellishments, but not really great for sewing clothes because of the fabric memory. See how I'm pulling here on this felt? It gets all out of shape and it doesn't remember where it was supposed to go. So it's not really comfortable for clothing fabric. Before we get started sewing, there's a few rules we need to make sure we're aware of. First of all, 2 hands and 2 eyes on your project at all times. Second, make sure you have your presser foot down before you start sewing. If you don't, you're going to get an octopus, which is a whole bunch of thread mess on the back of your fabric. Thirdly, if your machine makes a funny noise, stop immediately. Those are your 3 basic rules. Let's get started sewing. I'll demonstrate. When you start your seam, make sure you have your proper seam allowance, and then you can go forward 3 steps. Make sure you go back using your reverse button to lock those stitches in place. Then you can proceed on with your seam. Make sure you take out your pins every time you come to one. Don't run them over. You're going to have a broken needle and it could cause problems for your machine. There's another pin. Now when you get to the end of your seam, make sure you 3 steps backwards once again, and then you can just run off the fabric. Lift up your presser foot, pull out your fabric, making sure that your uptake lever is all the way at the top, and then you can cut off your fabric. When you're sewing your seams together, you may come to a corner where you'll need to turn, and I'm going to teach you how to pivot. When you're getting close to the corner, eyeball your seam allowance, make sure that your needle is in needle down position, or use your hand wheel to make sure your needle is down through the fabric, lift up your presser foot, and rotate your fabric 90 degrees. This will allow you to pivot and do right angles. And then you can just continue. If you need to do a curved seam, this is how you do it. Always, always, always start with your presser foot down and go forward 3 steps, backwards 3 steps, just like when you do a straight seam. It locks the stitches in place. Now as you're doing a curved seam, I want you to slightly rotate the fabric in the direction you want it to go, lining up your seam allowance as you go. Now when you get to a pin, take it out. And you just keep rotating your fabric. If you get to a sharp turn and it looks like the fabric is bunching, all you have to do is make sure your needle is down, lift up the presser foot slightly, and rotate your fabric to make sure it allows for the seam allowance. And keep rotating that fabric. We're not pushing down too hard, we're just rotating it slightly. If you push your fabric down too hard, the feet dogs underneath won't let the fabric go through. And when you finish with your curved seam, always, always, always 3 steps forward, 3 steps back. Make sure your arm take is in the up position. Lift up your presser foot, pull out your seam, your fabric, and cut. Now you've done a curved seam. Now, when you're doing a curved seam and you're going to turn it right side out, make sure you do slits all the way up to the stitch line, not over because you don't want to cut those stitches. This will allow for the fabric to give a little when you've turned it right side out. We've got 2 sewing machines here. Think of it like a car. This one's the luxury version. This is a more economical version. They do the same thing. They sew fabric together. They both get you from point A to point B. Let's talk about sewing machine parts. This is the spool pin and the spool cap. The spool of thread will go through the thread guides, as here, and then through the needle. We got the hand wheel on this side. This makes the needle go up and down. And then you have a presser foot. This is the foot right here, and there's a lever that goes up and down. You always have to make sure your presser foot is down before you start sewing. On the throat plate, you'll see right here, there are different measurements. These are called the seam allowances. You'll also have to make sure that you've got your stitch width and your stitch length fixed before you start sewing. Every machine has a reverse button. It makes the machine move the fabric backwards so you can lock your stitches. Underneath here is the bobbin. This is what locks in with the top thread to make the stitches stay together. Up here is where you would wind the bobbin to put in the bobbin case. Here's the foot pedal. This is what goes underneath the table where you put your foot on top, and it makes the machine actually work. It's just like a gas pedal. The harder you push it, the faster the machine goes. When you're getting ready to figure out what kind of project you want, you can either pick one from a pattern or come up with something on your own, which is what this T-shirt tote is what we're going to do. Doesn't have a pattern, just out of my imagination, but it works really good. Let's get started. So I've got a ton of these old T-shirts. You can have one with a graphic design or something super plain. I chose a clear white one. Now you've got your dinner plate. Go ahead and put your dinner plate over the neck of your T-shirt. Then you take one of those marking pens I showed you before and mark around the edge of the dinner plate. This gives you a clear line on where to cut your fabric when you take the dinner plate off. Take your fabric-only scissors and go ahead and cut just on that line. After you've done the neckline and cut that using the dinner plate, or you could use a different type of shape, doesn't matter. I used a dinner plate. Now we're going to do our sleeves. Make sure you keep the seam intact. That will give the bag more strength and stability. What I do is just snip off a hole and then I just cut around. If you cut both sides of the sleeve at one, you may miss and cut the seam, and that's not such a good thing. So just be gentle and patient and do one seam at a time, one cut at a time. So now I've cut off a sleeve. Go ahead and repeat it for the other side. After you cut your sleeves off, what are you going to do with the extra fabric? There's actually two projects you could do. One of which, you can make this into a square like this and put it onto the front of your bag. And that way it's a functional part of your project. If you decide to use one of your sleeves as a pocket, go ahead and cut it into a square and pin it on to the right side of your tote. Go 3 steps forward, 3 steps back like always, and run your seam allowance is about 1/4 of an inch from the edge of the pocket. Here's the pivot. Come to the corner. Make sure your needle down position. The needle is down through the fabric. Lift up your presser foot and rotate. And then complete the square. Three steps forward, 3 steps back. Make sure your arm is up, presser foot up, clip your thread. And now you have a pocket. The other thing you can do is cut off the edge of your sleeve. This becomes waist. This is folded together. Then cut 1-inch individual strips and do that for the entire sleeve. What we're doing is we're making a bracelet out of our extra t-shirt part. The necklace I have on is a variation of the bracelet that we're doing. What I did was I just cut the bottom of the t-shirt, not the sleeves. Now I've got all of these strips. What you do is pull them apart and stretch them so they're rounded. Do that for all of your sleeves. Keep going. Each sleeve has a seam that you're going to line up in the next step. The seam here, line them all up. All together. Then, using your remaining sleeve strip, wrap it tightly around those seams to hide them. Cut off the extra and tie the two ends together. Now you have a fun and functional bracelet. Now let's turn our bag the other way, inside out. What we're going to do now is line up the bottom seam of the shirt and pin it in a straight line. This will allow us to sew across the bottom so the stuff that we put in our bag doesn't fall out. Three steps forward, 3 steps back, and sew along the seam. Now our bag is closed. There's one more step we need to do, and that is to make a gusset. A gusset is when the bottom of the bag gives some depth. So what you do is you line your side seam up and your bottom seam and sew perpendicular. So when you do your gusset, how wide you want the bottom of your bag to be depends on how you make your gusset. What formula I picked is 2 inches from this corner down is 4 inches from this point to this point. Now after you've sewn, you can most likely cut this off if you want to, but I think that it adds some stability to the bottom of your bag. So when you put heavy things in there like books or a laptop, it keeps it quite sturdy in there. 3 steps forward always, 3 steps back, and go ahead and sew. When you gusset your bag, you want to make sure that both sides are the same distance. The distance from the tip here to this edge should be the same on both sides of the shirt. Now we're going to do the other side. And just like that, we've made our own pocket tote. Now, this one is quite white and quite plain, but the other things you can do with it, embellish it with stitching, color it with markers, paint, whatever you have on hand. You could also use a colored t-shirt if you want to, too. Easy project, super simple. Have fun. When you need a pattern, you have to go to your local fabric store to find one. Chances are they'll have a big area with lots of catalogs. Go ahead and look through the catalogs and find the pattern that you need. There should be a number just like this one next to the picture in the catalog. Then you can walk over to the patterns that are in file cabinets, they look like, with numbers in front. Dig through the filing cabinet neatly and find the number that you need. Make sure you also look for the size. Every pattern has a size component on it. Make sure it's the one that fits for you. Now, when you need to pick out the fabric for your pattern, flip over the pattern and there should be a whole lot of numbers and words on the back. Don't get intimidated. I'll step you through it. First of all, you want to look at the fabrics. For this pattern, it needs flannel sleepwear, which is pretty easy to find at your fabric store. Underneath is notions. Notions are thread, elastic, buttons, anything that would add to your project other than fabric. Underneath it says body measurements. You can take the tape measure, a flexible tape measure, and measure those parts that they say. Chest, usually, or hips. Then you look for the size. I want a medium today, so I'm looking under medium for the kids, and we're looking at pajama pants. Now, when you look under the pajama pants part, there's also pictures on this side. When you look for the pajama pants, there's two sizes of fabric. Fabric usually comes in two different sizes, 45 inches wide or 60. 45 inches wide is usually the ones that are on bolts, folded. For a 60-inch wide fabric, you're usually looking at those designer fabrics that are on rolls. It's just a rule of thumb to go by. So if you're looking for 45-inch wide fabrics in a medium for a child's size for this pattern, you're going to need 2 yards of flannel sleepwear fabric. After you get your pattern and your fabric and your notions for this project, it's time to open it up and get the instructions out. There's 2 parts. There's something that looks like newspaper. These are your pattern pieces. These are necessary for your project. The other thing that's in the package is the instructions, also very necessary for your project. You'll see here that we have Project A, pajama pants. Now we get to open it up. This is our pattern, our roadmap for making our pajama pants. What we're going to be making is trial size A. Those are pajama pants. In the next panel we have, it lists all of the pattern pieces in the whole entire pattern. But we're just focusing on pajama pants. Pants front A and pants back A. Number 1 and number 2, right here. In the next panel over, we have symbols that are used on the pattern. This arrow is the grain line. It should be placed on the straight part of the fabric parallel to the selvage. What's the selvage? I'll get to that in a second. Notches. The notches you need are for reference points that you're going to need when you mark with your water-soluble pen or chalk line. Before you start cutting your fabric, you need to always read this section here. Make sure you press and iron your fabric before you do anything. Circle your layout or cutting and pin the pattern and fabrics as it says in the next cutting layout section. Let's get our pattern piece out. Let's unfold it, and we have one of the pattern pieces we need right up on top. All right, using my paper scissors, I'm going to cut out the pattern roughly, not on the size that we need, just to get the extra off. Do that for both pattern pieces. Now that I have it roughly cut out, I need to place it on my fabric. It says to put the fold of the fabric here and the selvage on top with the cut side on this edge. Line up your fabric and your pattern. Since I'm using the medium size, I want to make sure that this medium line is close to the edge as possible without wasting fabric, but you don't need to go over because then you'd be out of fabric and it wouldn't fit. So make sure it fits perfect. Then take your pins, and we're going to pin on the inside of the paper of the marked medium line. And I have the right sides together on my fabric, just like the instructions say. You want to pin every couple inches to keep the paper down and cutting a whole lot easier. Do that for both pattern pieces. Now you've pinned your pattern on both pattern pieces, 1 and 2. Now it's time to cut them out. When you cut them out, make sure you use your fabric scissors, nice and sharp. You want to make sure that you cut along the medium line that I'm using. Figure out your size. You can cut just on or just above the medium line. The way I'm cutting is that I've placed my fabric flat against the table and my scissors are resting against the table as well. If you lift your fabric up and start cutting it, it won't be even. Go ahead and keep cutting all along the edge of your pattern pieces. Once we've got it all pinned together and cut out, we're going to have to do some markings with our water-soluble pen. Since we're working with a darker fabric, I chose my lighter pen. On the sides here, you'll see some notches. These are reference points. These are what you're going to line up when you start sewing your stuff together. So I just lift up the side of the pattern slightly and make that mark that's indicated on the pattern. Do that for all of the indicator marks. If there's 2 marks, go ahead and mark 2 marks. Make 2 marks. It looks like I've gotten all 3 reference points accounted for. Then, make sure you write that this is number 1, pants front, somewhere on this. Number 1, pants front. That makes it easier when you're putting the pieces together. What's front and what's back really does make a difference. Now we take our pins out. Don't throw away your pattern because you can always reuse it. Just fold it neatly and put it back in the package with the instructions and the other pattern pieces that you didn't use for this project. So we've got pant number 1 and pant side number 2. Pattern pieces all ready to go. See these reference points notches right here? We're going to line them up. Make sure your fabric is right sides together for this project. As the instructions say for this project, make sure you line up your notches and you're going to sew the inseam first. But before you sew, you need to pin. My mother always said a professional looking garment always had perfect pinning and ironing. So now that I've pinned my pieces together, edges lining up, let's go sew. We're sewing together the inside seam of our pants. Now we're going to put both of our parts right side together to do this inner leg seam right here. Right sides together always. You know those reference notches we made before? This is the time we'd use them. So start pinning here in the middle part. Line up these 2 seams. Then line up the edges here. And then pin in between. We're lining up those notches that we made. This one and this one. Lining them up and pinning. For this, you kind of want to pin every couple inches. It makes it so much easier because you're doing a curved seam. Remember how I taught you how to do that? Now this side. We've pinned on the end, and we've pinned in the middle. Now we pin in between. There's another notch. One more for good measure, as my mother would say. Now we're going to sew starting at one end all the way through to the other. Remember, your seam allowance is 5/8 inch, 3 steps forward, 3 steps back, always. Take your pins out as you sew. Here goes the curved part, easing into the curve. Almost halfway done. If you need to go slow, feel free. I'm going to have to lift up my presser foot to get it more aligned to where I need it to be for the seam allowance. Three steps forward, 3 steps back. We've just finished our inside seam. So after we've finished the inside center seam here, you may be tempted to go ahead and sew this edges. Not so. You need to fold it so the sides line up. Now these are starting to look like a pair of pants. Guess what we're going to do now? We have to sew up each side seam now. One side and then the other. You've got your reference notches to keep you in line and your pins. Now that we've pinned both side seams, let's sew them together. Remember to use 5/8 as your seam allowance. I know I keep harping on this, but if it's hard to remember, go ahead and put a sticky note right in front of your sewing machine so you'll remember. Different projects require different seam allowances. Some are 1/4 of an inch, some are 3/8 of an inch, just depends on the type of project. Your seam allowance should be in your roadmap, in your instructions. Look for it. There you go. We're finished sewing the side seams together. It's starting to look like a pair of pajama pants now. So now we're going to do the elastic part of our pants. The instructions say for this to fold over 1 inch. And then turn under the raw edge 1/4 of an inch. I've opened the seam allowance here and pressed it open. So it makes threading the elastic through the casing so much easier. This is the thing that takes the longest about sewing, is the pinning part. Trust me, it's totally worth it. All right, we've all pinned. Now, the most important part about the seam on the top for the waistband is I have to leave an opening. So when the elastic goes in, there's a place to put it. So I'm going to stop and start 2 inches in the front. If you need to take your plate off, go ahead. I need to, so I can get it in there nice and secure. So now we finished our pajama pant top. But how are we going to get the elastic through the hole we just made? It's called the casing. Remember our safety pin that we're going to use? Here's a tip. Clip the safety pin through the elastic, just like that. Then you go through the hole and you kind of work it all the way around the casing of the waistband, pulling the excess fabric away from the safety pin. Now we have our elastic through our casing, and we got two ends. We're going to overlap them and fit them on our person that is going to be wearing them. Since that person's not here today, my son, I think I measured them perfectly last time. So you overlap the edges, and you're going to sew the elastic together. Don't forget to go backwards and forwards. Doesn't hurt to do a few times. Put the elastic back through the waistband. And sew your opening closed. Here's the hem of our pants. You're going to fold it over 1 inch. And like we did for the elastic waistband, we're going to fold it over just 1/4 of an inch so the raw edges are hid, and then pin all the way around. Cutting off the extra thread. Now we can turn our pants right side out. Yay! We did it! Pajama pants, a quick and easy project that you can do.